Winter 1943. Deep in the forests of Bavaria, a single man ran through the snow. His breath came in ragged bursts, visible in the frozen air. Behind him, searchlights swept through the trees like mechanical fingers, hunting. This was Franz Müller, a German soldier turned prisoner of war, and he had just done the impossible. He had escaped from Stalag 7A, one of the most secure Allied prison camps in Germany. But here's what nobody understood. What would shock everyone who knew his story: in 72 hours, Franz would walk back through those gates voluntarily, his hands raised, asking to be let back in. What he would say in that moment would challenge everything the guards, the prisoners, and even the camp commander thought they knew about loyalty, survival, and the true cost of war. The story begins not with the escape, but with the man himself. Franz Müller was 26 years old when the war found him. He had grown up in a small village near Dresden, the son of a baker. His childhood smelled of warm bread and his father's flour-dusted apron. He had wanted nothing more than to inherit the bakery, to live a quiet life kneading dough and watching the seasons change through the shop window. But history had other plans. In 1939, Franz was conscripted into the Wehrmacht. He didn't believe in the grand speeches or the promises of glory. He went because he had no choice. Because young Ben in his village disappeared if they refused, because his mother begged him to stay alive. By 1942, Franz found himself on the Eastern Front. The cold there was unlike anything he had known. It wasn't just temperature. It was an emptiness that reached into your bones and hollowed you out from the inside. He watched friends die in the snow, their last words freezing on their lips. He saw villages burn. He saw children's eyes, wide and accusatory, staring at him from doorways. Something inside Franz began to break, not suddenly, but slowly, like ice cracking under invisible weight. Then came Stalingrad, the battle that would become a graveyard for hundreds of thousands of men. Franz's unit was caught in the encirclement. For weeks, they survived on frozen horse meat in desperation. Men ate leather belts. They burned books for warmth. Franz stopped thinking about the bakery. He stopped thinking about anything, except the next hour, the next minute. When the surrender finally came, in February 1943, Franz felt something unexpected: relief. The war was over for him. He had survived. But survival came with a new kind of suffering. The Soviet camps were death sentences wrapped in barbed wire. Franz watched skeletal men collapse in the snow and never rise. He knew he wouldn't last 6 months. So when a group of German prisoners organized a desperate westward march during a transfer, Franz joined them. They walked for 3 weeks, stealing food, hiding in barns, moving only at night. 17 men started that journey. 4 made it to Allied lines in Italy. Franz was one of them. The Americans processed them quickly. Papers were filled out. Questions were asked. Franz told them his name, his rank, his unit. He said nothing about what he had seen, what he had done. Some truths were too heavy to speak aloud. By autumn of 1943, Franz was transferred to Stalag 7A in Moosburg, Bavaria, a camp for German prisoners of war, run by the Allies. It wasn't cruel like the Soviet camps. There was food, thin but regular. There were barracks with roofs. There was a kind of order. But it was still a cage, and Franz had learned in Russia that cages kill you slowly, eating your spirit before they consume your body. Inside Stalag 7A, Franz discovered a strange world. The camp held thousands of German soldiers, men from every branch of service, every corner of the Reich. They were teachers and farmers, factory workers and students. Some were hardened Nazis who spoke of ultimate victory even behind barbed wire. Others were like Franz, men who had simply wanted to survive and now found themselves suspended in a limbo between their past and an unknowable future. The war continued somewhere beyond the fences, but here time moved differently, slower, drained of meaning. Franz kept to himself at first. He worked in the camp kitchen, peeling potatoes for hours each day. His hands remembered the motions from his father's bakery, the rhythmic movements that let the mind wander. But where his thoughts went, he didn't like. He thought about the village near Stalingrad, where his unit had sheltered for 2 nights. He thought about the old woman who had brought them water, her hands shaking, and the way his commanding officer had ordered the house searched anyway, everything of value taken. He thought about her face when they left. That look of betrayed dignity haunted him more than the violence, more than the blood. In the camp, Franz made one friend. His name was Klaus, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg who had lost his right arm at Kursk. Klaus had a philosopher's temperament, always questioning, always digging beneath surface explanations. They would sit together in the evenings, speaking in low voices about what waited for them after the war, if there would be an after. Klaus once said something that lodged in Franz's mind like a splinter. "We're not prisoners of the Allies, Franz. We're prisoners of what we've done, of what was done in our name. These fences are nothing compared to that." The idea of escape began not as a plan, but as a compulsion. Franz would stand at the fence line during recreation periods, staring at the Bavarian countryside beyond. The mountains in the distance called to him with the promise of freedom. But freedom toward what? Germany was being bombed into rubble. His village had likely been destroyed. His parents might be dead. Still, the urge to move, to break free, to reclaim some small piece of agency over his life, became overwhelming. In the camp, he was nothing, a number, a mouth to feed. Out there, he could at least choose his own steps. The escape itself took months to plan. Franz watched the guard rotations, memorized the blind spots, noted which sections of fence were less well lit. He stole wire cutters from the maintenance shed, hiding them under loose floorboards in his barrack. He collected extra food rations, dried bread, and small tins of meat, building a cache for the journey. Klaus knew about the plan but refused to join. "I'm too old for running," he said with a sad smile, "but I won't stop you. Maybe you'll find what you're looking for out there." The night Franz chose was moonless, thick with cloud cover. November rain had turned the campgrounds to mud, muffling sound. At 2 in the morning, during the shift change, when attention wavered, Franz moved. He crawled through the mud to the eastern fence, his heart hammering so hard he thought the guards must hear it. The wire cutters worked slowly, each snip seeming loud as a gunshot in his ears. Minutes stretched like hours. Finally, a gap. Franz squeezed through, tearing his jacket on the barbs, and then he was outside. He ran, not with any strategy, just raw animal instinct to put distance between himself and captivity. The forest swallowed him, dark and vast. For hours he moved through the trees, stumbling over roots, branches whipping his face. By dawn, he was miles away, collapsed beneath a pine tree, gasping, disbelieving. He had done it. He was free. Freedom, Franz discovered, was not what he had imagined. The first day brought a wild euphoria, a physical sensation of possibility. He moved through the forest like a ghost, avoiding roads, drinking from streams. The landscape was beautiful in its November starkness, all bare branches and grey skies. For those first hours, Franz felt almost reborn, disconnected from everything that had come before. But by the second day, reality began to assert itself with cruel clarity. He had no destination. The realization came slowly, then all at once. Where was he going? His village near Dresden was hundreds of miles away, deep in territory that might now be Soviet-occupied. He had no papers, no money, no way to prove his identity beyond his Wehrmacht dog tags, which made him as much a target as a protection. Every person he encountered was a potential threat. The German military police would arrest him as a deserter. Civilians might turn him in for reward money or out of fear. The Allies would return him to the camp or worse. On the third day, hunger began to speak with a voice louder than hope. Franz had eaten through his meager supplies. He tried to steal eggs from a farmhouse, but was chased off by dogs. He dug for root vegetables in harvested fields, finding only frozen earth. The cold that had seemed invigorating at first now worked its way under his skin. His torn jacket provided little protection. At night he shivered in makeshift shelters of pine branches, unable to light a fire for fear of being spotted. But the physical hardship wasn't what broke him. It was the loneliness, the absolute isolation. In the camp, for all its misery, Franz had been part of something. There were routines, conversations, the simple human comfort of being seen by others. Out here, he was erased. He was nothing. Hours would pass without him speaking a word, and he began to fear he was losing the ability to form words at all. He talked to himself to hear a human voice, reciting childhood prayers his mother had taught him. But even his own voice sounded foreign in the vast silence of the forest. On the fourth day, Franz nearly died. He had worked his way down into a valley, following what he thought was a path toward a town. Instead, he stumbled into a marsh, hidden beneath a deceptive crust of frozen grass. The icy water swallowed him to his waist. Panic set in immediately. He thrashed, making it worse, sinking deeper. For several terrible minutes, Franz thought this was how it would end, alone in a nameless swamp, his body never found. But with a desperate surge of strength, he caught hold of a fallen branch and pulled himself free, collapsing onto solid ground, soaked and shaking uncontrollably. He found shelter in an abandoned woodcutter's hut, and managed to start a small fire despite his shaking hands. As warmth slowly returned to his body, Franz had time to think clearly for the first time since escaping. What was he running toward? The question had haunted him since the beginning, but now he confronted it directly. His home was gone, his old life impossible to reclaim. Germany itself was dying, cities turned to ash, the Reich crumbling under the weight of its own evil. There was no victory to return to, no triumph, only defeat and accounting. And what was he running from? The camp? It wasn't cruel. The guards were mostly fair, the conditions bearable. His fellow prisoners. Klaus had been a better friend than most. The routine? It had actually been a kind of mercy, a structure that kept the mind from devouring itself. Franz realized with stunning clarity that he hadn't been running from the camp at all. He had been running from himself, from the question of what kind of man he was, what kind of man he had become in the war. The decision formed slowly, like water finding its level. Franz sat in that abandoned hut for hours, watching the fire burn down to embers. He thought about Klaus's words, "We're prisoners of what we've done." The escape hadn't freed him from that. If anything, being alone with his thoughts in the forest had forced him to confront every memory he'd tried to bury. The villages he'd marched through, the orders he'd followed, the times he'd looked away when he should have spoken, the times he'd spoken when he should have acted. Franz understood something profound in that moment. There was no running from history, from complicity, from the weight of what had been done in his name and with his participation, however reluctant. The only path forward was through, not around. He had to face what he'd been part of, acknowledge it, carry it. And strangely, the place where he could do that most honestly was back in the camp, among other men wrestling with the same questions, in a community of shared guilt and shared hope for redemption. At dawn on the 5th day, Franz began walking back, not running this time, not hiding. He walked openly along the road, his hands in his pockets, his face toward the rising sun. Farmers in wagons passed him. A patrol of American soldiers drove by in a jeep but didn't stop, assuming he was just another displaced person in a continent full of them. The journey that had taken him days of desperate flight through the forest took only hours of steady walking along the road. When Franz approached the camp, mid-morning light painted the barbed wire in shades of silver. The guard towers stood as they always had, watchful but not threatening. Franz stopped at the main gate, raised his hands, and called out in German. The guards, young American soldiers, came forward with rifles ready, confused. Escaped prisoners didn't walk back through the front door. Franz tried to explain in his broken English, piecing together the words. He told them his name, his barrack number. He told them he had escaped 5 days ago. He told them he was coming back. The guards didn't know what to make of it. They conferred in low voices, then called for their sergeant, who called for an officer. Franz waited, hands still raised, patient now in a way he hadn't been before. Within an hour, he was standing before Captain Morrison, the assistant camp commander, in a small administrative office. Morrison was a tall man, with kind eyes and the wary expression of someone who'd seen too much of war. He studied Franz for a long moment before speaking. "You escaped?" Morrison asked in careful German. Franz nodded. "And you came back?" Another nod. "Why?" This was the moment. Franz searched for the right words, knowing they would never be fully adequate, but knowing he had to try. He spoke slowly, his voice rough from days of silence. "I escaped because I thought freedom was out there, beyond the fences. I thought if I could just get away from the camp, from the war, from everything, I could start over. I could become someone new." He paused, gathering courage for what came next. "But I learned that freedom isn't a place. It's not something you run toward. Real freedom comes from facing what you've done, from being honest about who you've been, from choosing who you want to become." Franz continued, his words coming faster now, as if a dam had broken. "In the camp, I'm with other men who are asking the same questions I am. What was our responsibility? What did we allow to happen? How do we live with what we've seen and done? Out there, alone, I was just running. Here, maybe I can learn to stand still and face it. Maybe we all can, together. That's why I came back." Captain Morrison sat back in his chair, studying Franz with new attention. He had processed thousands of prisoners, seen every variety of human response to captivity: defiance, despair, resignation, rage. But this was something different. This was a man choosing his prison, not because he'd given up, but because he'd found something there more valuable than physical freedom. Morrison made a decision. He wouldn't punish Franz for escaping. Instead, he asked if Franz would be willing to speak to the other prisoners about his experience. Within days, Franz found himself standing before a gathering of several hundred German POWs in the camp's main assembly area. The story of the man who escaped and came back had spread through the barracks like wildfire, sparking intense debates. Some called Franz a fool. Others whispered that he might be a collaborator, that his return was some kind of trick. But most were simply curious. Klaus sat in the front row, his one arm folded across his chest, his face unreadable. Franz told them everything. He described the escape, the initial euphoria, then the creeping horror of isolation. He spoke about the marsh that nearly killed him, the abandoned hut, the long night of reckoning. And then he said something that would echo through that camp and later through many others where his story would be told. I used to think the opposite of captivity was freedom, but I learnt it's not. The opposite of captivity is responsibility. Out there I was free of fences, but also free of community, free of accountability, free of the hard work of becoming better than I was. Here, we have a chance to do that work together. The response was mixed. Some men walked away angry, refusing to accept what they heard as anything but weakness. But others stayed, and in the following weeks, something began to shift in Stalag 7A. Discussion groups formed. Men started talking openly about their experiences in the war, not with pride, but with painful honesty. They debated their culpability, their choices, their futures. It wasn't therapy exactly, wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning, a tentative reaching towards something like moral reckoning. Franz remained in the camp until the war's end in May 1945, when liberation came and prisoners were processed for release. He learned that his village near Dresden had indeed been destroyed, first by Allied bombing, then in the Soviet advance. His father had died in the raids. His mother had survived and was living with relatives in Bavaria. Franz found her in a refugee settlement near Munich. Their reunion was quiet, marked by tears and long silences. She held his face in her worn hands and said, "You came home, that's all that matters." But Franz knew it was more complicated than that. He had come home, yes, but not to a place. He had come home to himself, or at least to a version of himself he could live with. In the years after the war, Franz opened a small bakery in Munich, just as he'd always dreamed. But he also did something else. Once a month he hosted gatherings for veterans, men struggling with guilt and trauma, and the impossible question of how to live after participating in history's darkest chapter. These weren't celebrations or justifications. They were spaces for brutal honesty, for admitting what had been done, for carrying the weight together rather than alone. Franz never claimed to have found redemption, only direction. He would tell newcomers to these gatherings the same thing he'd told his fellow prisoners in Stalag 7A. We can't escape what we were part of. We can only choose what we do with that knowledge, how we live now, what we build with whatever time we have left. Klaus survived the war too, and became a regular at Franz's gatherings. The two old friends would sit together as they had in the camp, speaking in low voices about memory and responsibility. Klaus once asked Franz if he ever regretted coming back to the camp. Franz thought for a long moment before answering. "Every day I regret what I was part of in the war. Every day I regret the things I didn't do, the times I stayed silent. But coming back to the camp, that's the one decision I've never regretted. It was the moment I stopped running." Franz Müller lived until 1987. He never became famous, never wrote a memoir, never sought recognition for his unusual choice. But the men who attended his gatherings, the prisoners who heard his story in the camp, they remembered. They carried forward the lesson that true freedom isn't found in escape, but in facing what we've done and choosing, every day, to be better than we were. In a century marked by people running from responsibility, Franz walked toward it. In a war that stripped men of their humanity, he made the radical choice to reclaim his. The barbed wire of Starlock 7 is long gone, rusted away or torn down. The camp itself is now farmland, peaceful and ordinary. But the question Franz Müller asked remains: what are we prisoners of? And what does it mean to be truly free? Perhaps his story suggests that freedom begins not when we break through the fences that contain us, but when we stop running from the truth of who we are, gather the courage to face it, and make the daily choice to build something better from the ruins of what was lost. That is the shocking revelation Franz offered when he walked back through those gates. Liberation comes not from escape, but from standing still and facing yourself. That is the hardest journey of all.